Hello and welcome to my video. Today we are making a sleep sack for my daughter Gwen. You're going to need to start with a baby blanket. This is for summertime, so I used a light muslin blanket, and the first thing I did was try to iron the wrinkles out as best I could. Next, I sewed it in half along the two edges. If your blanket is not perfectly square, then you want to sew along the long side. I tried to edit the sewing portion of the video out as much as possible because it took a really long time and it wasn't very interesting to watch. So once the long side was sewed together, you then want to unfold it and refold it so that the seam you just sewed is in the middle. This seam is going to be the center front of the sleep sack, and it's going to be where the zipper is going to go. So then you want to sew across the bottom length side of what will be your sleep sack. And I ironed it nice and flat again because I wanted it to sit nicely for when I sewed my zipper on. I didn't really have a pattern for this. I kind of just made it up as I go along, and it was a learning process. It turned out really well, I think, but I'll give you some tips and tricks along the way of what I think I could have done better now that it's finished. So now that the bottom seam is sewn up, try to keep it as straight as possible. I personally find using pins really annoying, so I try to avoid them as much as possible. Next, you're going to decide how long you need it to be for your child. In order to do so, I put my child on top of it. It's about twice as long as she was at the time. I knew I wanted her to have space to grow in, and I didn't mind her having a little extra room to kick her legs around. Oh, she was so little. I filmed this a while ago, and editing has been quite a process. So I cut off a little bit from the top, but like I said, I chose to leave it long. You wouldn't necessarily need to do that. And then I pulled a shirt. You can use a onesie. I just used a little shorts outfit that fit her well, and I used that to mark off where the neckline, the shoulder seams, and the arm seams would go. I tried to be very, very careful and make sure it was centered as nicely as possible. I really just eyed it up. It's not that scientific of a process. You just want to make sure that both sides are the same and that they will, fit your child. So using a garment they already have that fits well, or one that's a little big, if you want them to grow into it like I did, would be a great way to do it. So like I said, I marked it up, and then I went in with a ruler, and my camera fell down, and I finished off, connected my little spots. So I did one spot on either side of the neckline hole, as well as a spot at the top of the armhole and the bottom of the armhole. And I believe I just eyed it up. Once again, it doesn't have to be perfect. The human body isn't symmetrical, and no one will notice if they're not exactly perfect. And then I used my ruler or a straight edge of any type that you happen to have to connect it down to the side. And mine got wider as it went down because I wanted it to fit her nicely at the top, but for her to have room to move around a little bit at the bottom. Once I had my design marked, I double checked it again with her original outfit to make sure it still looked as though it was in line and matched up, and I decided that for the most part it did. And this is me drawing those lines that I was just telling you about a couple seconds ago. And I tried to just make sure that they were as even as possible. I used a black Sharpie so that way you guys could see this on camera. I know it's still a little hard to see. You do not need to use a black Sharpie by any means so long as you can see it. But it also, I'll say, it didn't hurt the design. I could not see it when it was done because I was drawing on what became the inside of the garment, and a lot of this became the seam lines that were clipped away anyway. Okay, here is where I would make one change. I did cut it out, and I'm happy with the way I cut it out. I would have done, if I were to do this again, a zigzag stitch all around the raw edges, because one issue that I did have when my daughter wore this was the armholes, which were up the part of the garment that really kind of gets used the most, putting it on and off a squirming baby. They did wear out a little more quickly than I would have liked, and I think if they had a strong zigzag stitch there, then they would have lasted a little longer and not needed a patch job. But this is where I sewed up the shoulder seams as well as those side seams that I cut with the ruler, and I left the armholes unsewn as well as the neck hole. I believe I also went in and adjusted the shape of the neck hole because I wanted it to open a little bit lower in the front, the way a t-shirt traditionally does. That usually is higher up in the back than it is in the front. So I just unfolded it so that way I could mark how I wanted it to go. And I believe that's what you can see me doing here. And once I marked it a little bit lower, then I just cut and made sure I kept it as even as I possibly could. Sometimes the video goes too fast and I have to talk really fast, and then I guess sometimes not. I will say I learned a lot in video editing this video. It took me honestly months. My daughter is a lot bigger now than she was when I first made it and recorded it. I recorded this and made this as a gift for my daughter for Easter and gave it to her early. And now it is August. So here's one other issue that I would like to change. So I was between two different zippers that I had. I liked the pink color, but I had this blue recycled zipper that was longer, and I went with the blue one just because of the extra length. I would suggest going for an even longer zipper than I had. This was left over from a dress that I had pulled it out of, and I was just using what I had because this was in the middle of the pandemic and I was not about to go anywhere, but needed a sleep sack now. So she was still able to get in and out of it. I believe it was a 16 or 17 inch zipper that I used, but I would have preferred to get one that was roughly 24 inches, which was roughly my daughter's height. So it would have been easier to get her in and out of the sleep sack. You could also use Velcro, but this is what I did. So once I had my zipper pinned on, I had to sew it down, and I just sewed it on either side of the zipper using a zipper foot. One came with my sewing machine. I tried to show you how I lined it up here. So I just sewed on the remnants of that center seam line. I sewed it down onto there, and then I did the same thing on the other side of the zipper. So I could not sew and hold the camera at the same time, so you won't actually see me sewing, but that's how I did it. And this is me trying to show you that it was still sewed together. So once your zipper is sewed down, the next step would be to rip that original seam that you sewed along the edges. That is now your center seam where your zipper is. And this would have gone much faster if I had a seam ripper, but mine were stuck in my school building, so it took me a very long extended period of time to do so. I had to pick out every little stitch with a pin and use scissors to cut it when necessary. I was very frustrated, but once again, I didn't know when I was going to be able to have access to my stuff again, and I eventually ended up ordering new ones. But once again, with quarantine, everything took longer for shipping, and I needed a new sleep sack for my daughter now. So this is just me taking forever, pulling out one little stitch at a time so that way you can see my zipper. I believe before I pulled it out all the way though, I just needed enough so that I could move the zipper so that I could sew the very top edges. So I think I just pulled out a little bit, moved my zipper head so that I could finish the top, and then pulled out the rest. I also would like to point out that I recorded the whole entire process, and it was probably about 4 hours of footage to sort through. And the hard part was, because I made such long recordings of what I was doing, I had to sit through them all and sift through it and try to find what was actually useful and what wasn't. And it took a very long time, especially since the files were so big. It took a long time for it to load, and I had to wait for videos to buffer. I learned a lot in the making of this video. So yeah, this is just more of me fiddling with that seam to pull it out for my zipper. But this is really a nice clean way so that it looks more professional and it's a little bit more hidden when it's done. And once again, if you do this with a seam ripper, which I highly suggest if you have one, it'll take you probably 2 or 3 minutes instead of the 30 or so that it took me. Yeah. I would also like to point out that when I started this video, my hair was soaking wet, and this way, not even, I guess about halfway through, my hair is completely dry and a hot mess, but you know, quarantine life. So that was my zipper, all ripped and beautiful. Next thing I needed to do was make some edging. I wanted to enclose the edges of the armhole as well as the neck hole. So I used some of the scrap that I had cut off the top of the blanket when I made the neck and armholes. If you wanted more scrap, you could even make your design shorter. Like I said, there was lots of excess at the bottom for my baby to kick her legs, more than she would possibly need, and I definitely could have cut more. So once I'd already had a finished edge, so I just needed to finish the other edge, and I wanted to keep it similar to the first one. And once again, I hate using pins, so I could have pinned this and sewn very carefully, but I would rather spend more time actually sewing than pinning and sewing and unpinning. So I folded it over once, and I sewed the seam down, and then because I wanted that raw edge to be completely enclosed, I folded it over a second time and tried to sew as close to the edge as possible. I also needed to trim the top of the zipper edges off so that I could make sure it was a nice smooth and it ended right at the tip. I sewed it down. You just fold it over the edge of your fabric, and once again, it would be really helpful if the edge of your fabric had a zigzag stitch going around it before you did the step. I'm not sure if I did around the neck hole or not, but I didn't have any problems with the neck hole, so I think that's just because it's less finagling than it is to get a baby's arms into the little armholes. It also might help if you made the armholes a little bit bigger than you thought you needed, because I think that would have made it easier to get her in and out as well. But yeah, I just folded it and sandwiched it around. I tried to show you as best I could in the camera, but I don't have a professional filming station. This was the second film I ever shot, and you just see a lot of my hands moving, which is why I cut out a lot of the footage, because who wants to stare at my arm for 3 hours? I know I don't. I didn't even like doing that part when I was editing. But in this case, I did pin it down because I did not want to have to re-sew this armhole multiple times, or I'm sorry, neck hole. And I believe that is me just cutting out some random threads from previous sewing spots. And make sure it's sandwiched really good, because you don't want it to slip and then have a hole between your, what is that called? I forget. I said it before. Let's call it fabric sandwich. Between your fabric sandwich and your material. You just don't want it to fall apart. And this obviously took me a little while. Ironically, the editing of this video took much longer than the actual sewing project itself. But yeah, I'm about done pinning it here. I can tell because I cut off the other top edge of the zipper to make sure that it would be a nice soft top edge that I wouldn't have to worry about falling apart or anything, or sticking out or poking the baby. And then I just trimmed it. I left about a 1/4 inch more than was necessary right at the edge, so that way I could flip those edges in before I sewed it, and they would be better finished and I wouldn't have to worry about them fraying or anything. So that's me folding it in. You want to make sure that you don't overlap the edge of the zipper, because you don't want to get your zipper stuck on it or not be able to zipper it up all the way. So this part was a part where I needed to be very careful. So next I had to do the little armholes, and because they were so tiny, I didn't feel like I would be able to do a good job on my sewing machine, so I sewed by hand. And I sewed by hand some more. and some more, and some more. I was really careful to do really cute, pretty, perfect stitches. Oh. And I kept sewing, and I kept sewing, and this really shouldn't have taken that long. It was a very small little piece, but I was trying to be very careful and make it look really nice for my daughter to use. And you know, it was a little bit for naught because, like I said, the armholes did tear a little bit. I don't think my sewing job, my stitches stayed in perfectly, but the material kind of, I think, ripped off from the end. So I think if I had a zigzag stitch inside the actual cloth of the sleep sack, then the I still can't think of what to call that. Our fabric sandwich would have stayed on better. I think the material itself just fell apart. But that's one of the issues when working with light muslin fabrics, I guess, particularly recycled ones. I did really enjoy making this product, and my daughter loved using it. I'm not saying it was the sleep sack, but the first night that she slept in it was the first night that she slept through the night in about 3 months. So, highly suggest. And that is when I finally finished it, and I was really excited to show you guys. I did this in less than a day with a toddler. Without a toddler, well, I guess she was an infant at the time, but without an infant, it would have been a lot less time. And this is her sleeping in it and looking all adorable. This is us on Easter because I made it for her for an Easter present. And she has used it for quite a while. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I enjoyed making it, and I learned a lot. And that's all. Thanks for watching. Bye!